Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Cecilie Kobek-Kjeldager, who is from the University in Denmark. How are you today, Cecilia?
I'm good, thank you. And how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Before we get started today, I think it would be good for you to give the audience a little bit more background about yourself and actually probably the correct pronunciation of your name as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a minute to give more of an introduction.
Thank you, Laura. So yeah, my name is Cecilie Kobek-Kjeldager, and I'm a postdoc in Denmark at a university called Aarhus University. Um, and I'm trained as a biologist originally, but then did my PhD in animal science, both in Denmark, Aarhus University, and my PhD was actually about the large litter size that we really are successful in having in Denmark. These very hyperprolific sows and ways to manage them. But actually, what I want to talk to you today is not about the issues with the hyperprolific sow, but actually what the sow experiences afterwards, after she's done producing and she comes into this period where we can call it the Cull Sow period, and what she experiences there.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that will be great. And that's where we'll really start is let's talk about that Cull Sow. I do think she is kind of the forgotten animal. There's many
Yes.
discussions here in the United States on economics, right? So after we cull her, do we keep her for a period of time and allow her to gain some weight, or do we sell her immediately? And but I don't think there's much discussion about how we manage her beyond that. And so let's just kind of start with what are you noticing for trends with coal sow management?
So I would agree that it is kind of a forgotten stage. And first, I would start by just defining the Cull Sow, what we're actually talking about. Just it's from the time where the farmer is now deciding this sow is going to go out of production. So it can actually be it can be a long time, but it could also be only a few days. So it can, like you say, she can stay for some time at the farm and be fed more. But what we have of data from Denmark, it is actually quite often that the sows are being sent to slaughter right after weaning. We have actually quite a lot of sows that are still lactating. Of course, for these also economic reasons that start feeding a sow that is not going to produce more is of course going to be economically a challenge. But then actually, um, what I think we should think about where I think I didn't say that, but actually um, my topic is behavior and welfare. So if we want to talk about the welfare of these sows, there's a lot of challenges or dilemmas because are they actually fit for transport and what actually happens to them at during transport or later on at the slaughterhouses. There's a lot of different issues here and issues with well um, sustainability issues also if the sow is not fit for transport, yeah, keeping her some longer, but or killing her on farm is also an option. But then we will, from the farmer's perspective, maybe have some issues as, of course, he loses some potential money from actually sending her on to slaughter, and we can also talk about some meat waste if we don't send her off to slaughter. Um, but what, of course, people mainly are doing is sending them on to the slaughterhouse and doing transport. And I want to talk to you here about why these sows might not be so fit for transport. Um, because the way we've genetically selected these sows, they are of course like bred for giving birth to this large litter size, and with it there also comes a high heat production. If they're also still lactating, they produce a lot of heat, and so they're really vulnerable to heat stress. And well, you can imagine when sows are loaded onto a truck, we don't have that much control of the thermal environment. So there is a really large issue with the risk of heat stress when we have sows during transport.
Mhm. When you talk about heat stress, are you talking about even in times when maybe it's not as hot outside? So, right, again, we understand summer and heat stress, but obviously a sow that's lactating is producing more heat. So, is there maybe a time when it's not quite what we would consider the typical season of heat stress that we still should be considering this sow and her potential to exhibit heat stress?
Yeah, I think because when we have these vehicles where they're transported on, of course, there's also quite a high stocking density, and we do know that um, when they're stationary, when they're not driving, and if there's not like mechanical ventilation, or even if there is mechanical ventilation, we also know that it becomes a lot warmer inside this truck than it is outside. So the summertime or the warm period will actually be longer when you're inside these vehicles. So that would be a challenge. And we've in my group we've made some survey questionnaires to drivers of Cull Sows, and they talk about, well, heat stress being a main challenge that they are, well, afraid of, and that really stationary periods where the truck is not driving, even well, on purpose or not, is really something they find is really, well, a challenge. That even so, in the European legislation, there is rules for when the driver, they have, after 4.5 hours of driving, they have to have a break for the sake of the driver, and on a 45-minute break. So they have to do this. But this is also something that could potentially challenge the sows, because a 45-minute break, maybe at, well, at the side of some highway where you can't place the vehicle in shade, or if the mechanical ventilation is not good enough, and then we really have potential, well, issues for heat stress, even if it's not really hot outside.
And how does that differ from like a market pig? Is there any differences that we should be taking into account for transportation, or are they similar?
No, there are, well, quite there. Sadly, there's not that much scientific literature, but what we know really from uh, these, well, we've talked now about the risk for heat stress. They are just a lot more at risk for that, but also just in general, they're, now I talked about before, or I mentioned fitness for transport. This is like the concept that they have to, before being going on the vehicle, yeah, the driver and the farmer has to see that the animal is fit for transport. And there's, well, there is a discussion about what is actually fitness, what is being fit for transport. Is it, well, there is actually no scientific, like, clear definition. So you can also say, if scientists can't agree, how can the driver and the farmer and all that agree? And they don't. uh, but there is this discussion that maybe coal sows are never really truly fit for transport. And one of the reasons is also some of the work from the group I'm in, that we find that these coal sows, their clinical status, they deteriorates from before being loaded on to afterwards. So we've done, yeah, before and after, looking at wounds and abrasions all over the body, and also taking rectal temperature, a lot of different measures, and see that just in general, these sows deteriorate, become worse over time. And this is even when they are all decided to be fit for transport. So, if my point here is, if fitness for transport is not deteriorating, not becoming worse, or not being affected by transport, which is actually what the European legislation says, the animal should not get worse from transport, then no cull sows are truly actually fit for transport. But this is like the extreme version of it, of course. There is other people that would disagree that they are fit for transport, just as long as they don't have large shoulder ulcers or stuff like that. But yeah.
Mhm. And one of the things that we use a lot in the United States is body condition. And so we might, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the calipers that many of us use on the sow farms that give us some estimate of back fat cover
Yeah.
and body size. But is there any data? I know you said science is pretty limited, but is there any data that would suggest that a sow with a body condition score of 2, so relatively thin, would have a higher increase of being a downer sow at the time she gets to the harvesting facility?
Yes, and that's actually a really good question, but because in general they are cull sows are just thinner, so there are more of those, and then the thin sows is what becomes normal, and then the farmers and drivers, they maybe don't see it as an issue because it's just normal that they're thinner. But we actually do see that the lower body condition score, they do have higher risks of, yeah, deteriorating. So there is an association there.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And so one of the conversations we have a lot here in the United States too is that the composition of the sow has changed. So from 15, 20 years ago, we used to have a sow that carried more back fat and not as much lean. And today, obviously, they're very lean with low back fat. And when a animal nurses and doesn't have enough food, or it doesn't eat enough to support the milk production, right, they're going to take that off of their body mass. And so we anticipate our sows today to lose muscle because that's obviously what they're comprised mostly of. So does that have any impact on potential injuries in transport?
And definitely, that's another good point. Because, of course, both, I guess, also in the States and also in Europe, most sows are crated, so they really don't have much muscle strength. They are just, yeah, they're confined. And well, the thing is with during transport, when we were asking the drivers about what do you think is going on inside when you're driving, they thought the sows were mainly lying down. But now we actually managed now to put video inside, which is not easy. Um, just tell you, not easy. Things break and stuff. But now we have video recordings, and we actually see that they're almost standing all of the time. So imagine being the sow that has so limited muscle strength, have been in a crate for so long time, and with, of course, all this high heat production and all this, and then just standing for many hours, and of course being mixed with other sows, and we know that this, of course, mixing unfamiliar animals, we have aggression. So this is, of course, one of the reasons why we see this clinical deterioration, is because they're fighting and they will be exhausted. And that's also, we have another study also where we then look what's going on when they're at the slaughterhouse, their lairage pen, when their load is off, and we see that they're actually, the first half hour they're fighting some more, but then they lie down. And I was like, why are they're lying now really quickly? Well, now that I know that they're standing up inside the truck, I realized they are most likely very exhausted, and they prioritize lying down over actually getting to something to drink. uh, so we really have some, yeah, issues, because, yeah, now I'm moving on to this lairage pen or in the slaughterhouse. There is like this thought that this is the time where they should rehydrate and rest before going into the slaughter line, because that would also affect meat quality. And there's also, of course, a welfare perspective that they have not been able to drink and eat during transport. um, but what we're actually seeing is that they really don't have much, well, opportunity, or they don't choose to drink because they can't if there's not enough drinkers, or they're so exhausted from the transport. So it's really not, maybe the point of resting and rehydrating is maybe not really working in the setup, at least the slaughterhouse that we're looking at. And I imagine it not being very different, because that's not, the pens here are not made for a longer stay. It's mostly in and out again.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's quite interesting. And I was just kind of listening to what you were saying, and in some ways, I could argue, well, a market hog is not much different, right? They Some will stand, some will sit. There is a little bit of aggression, of course, that occurs in those market trucks. They're going to get into a holding area after transport, stand and lay down. So how is the Cull Sow necessarily different in your mind versus the market hog, right? I'm just trying to kind of think through, if we're going to make changes, how do we view them differently besides muscle strength?
Well, of course, that the heat production is
Yes,
quite
right. Yeah,
different, of
right.
course.
Hmm.
Um, then sows are just really aggressive. We know pigs in general have to establish this dominance hierarchy, but really, the sows are really, there's some really angry ladies in there, and and there's no room to get away. So that's really because. So I've also done another study on weaner pigs, 30-kilo pigs, and I was really surprised to see how little they were fighting. They're also mixed, but they're actually not fighting very much compared to these cull sows. It is just really intensive. And I'm not actually aware that we've done studies on slaughter pigs with video inside. There's really not very much literature or behavior during transport for any of the different stages of pig life. So I'm not sure that we actually know how much is going on, but I would still imagine a lot less than
Yes,
the
you're
cull
right.
sows.
You're right. Sows are very aggressive when we're trying to establish a hierarchy.
And then, of course, being a cull sow, just to answer your question, there's a reason why the sow has been taken out. Maybe she is actually, their health status is not doing or isn't very good. It might be already that she's lameness is one of the main reasons that sows are taken out, or old age. So they are just in a more vulnerable setting than these, like, yeah, slaughter pigs, finisher pigs that are good health status and yeah, and have been, yeah, muscle strength and all that.
Mhm. Yeah, and you raise a very good point, right? Is that they are vulnerable in a lot of different ways, right? And so they do require different attention. And I want to go back to that aggression comment a little bit because it made me think of some work. Years ago, I ran a study where we looked at just different housing environments in gestation, right? So the stalls versus group housing, larger pens, et cetera. And one of the things that we always had discussions on at that farm was how to minimize the aggression that occurs when you first introduce sows into a group pen. And so I keep thinking about that as far as some of the challenges that you're seeing in the truck. Um, some of the things we would try would be like putting baby powder or something in their noses that would kind of all make them smell the same, if you will. And
Yeah.
other things would be like giving them a bunch of feed before we mixed them into group pens. And so have you looked at any of those things to maybe try to minimize that aggression in transport?
There is one issue with giving, like, okay, if sows are hungry, they will be more aggressive potentially. But we can't really feed them beforehand because actually they're often fasted before, so we don't have issues with both. Well, motion sickness is an issue with pigs, and also later at the slaughterhouse, if they have full intestines, that would be there's risk of contamination. So for that reasons, they are actually often fasted, which might then make them more, yeah, aggressive and all that. But actually, another cull sows are forgotten, but one that is even more forgotten is, well, the boars, the boars that are used as teaser boars or whatever. There's not that many of them, but when they're transported individually. They're like there's yeah. There are of course
Divided.
more in the truck, but there's yeah, different compartments for them,
Hmm.
because we always say boars are really aggressive, and that's true. But the sows are also so, and yeah, they've just been in the crates and haven't been mixed for a while. So we do know that this is an issue. So one thing that could potentially be done is, yeah, individually in the truck. But of course, that's then more expensive because then you can't put so many sows in the truck, and then you have that whole economic uh, side to it,
Right,
which is always.
right. And that creates a high challenge for sure. Yeah, and so I think that's actually interesting. I didn't realize that I guess I never really thought about it, transporting pigs that they could develop motion sickness. And so I do think that's actually an interesting comment and observation is that we need to be thinking about how to mitigate some of those, but yet you're right, the feed is obviously a challenge when we're sending pigs to harvest. And so um, any other thoughts that producers could try in this time frame to try to prepare their cull sows for market? Any recommendations if you were to have your own facility? What types of processes would you employ when you're ready to market those cull sows?
Well, actually, if I really and the well, I started out saying this also, that maybe the sows should not be transported at all. So that's, of course, no, from economical reasons, that's an issue, or for the wastefulness of that meat, because of if you cull the sow at the farm, often you can't sell it. But from a welfare perspective, I think it would be the most well for the sow. It would be best not to have to put her through that because I really think it's difficult to mitigate those different issues. And
Mhm,
yeah,
mhm. Yeah, I agree. It sounds like quite a challenge in many different facets and great opportunities, right? For someone like you who's involved in research, it gives you some wonderful opportunities to answer some
yes,
questions and look for some solutions.
yes,
Um, One of the other things that we didn't really hit on because we have focused on welfare, but what about biosecurity? That's
yes.
obviously a big one here in the United States, and so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
That's also very good. Yeah. So in Denmark, we really there's a high focus on biosecurity. And well, actually, so a truck coming in to get Cull sows will not, well, a truck can only get into a farm if it's completely clean. So if it's getting a full load of slaughter pigs or wiener for further transport, then the truck can come in because it's completely clean and then it can go away. But with cull sows, there's often not that many sows per herd, so it will go and pick up different sows. And because of that, then the farmers don't want the truck going into their herd. So instead of in Denmark, we use pickup facilities, some kind of other vehicle where the farmer brings out the sows a few maybe hours before or maybe just minutes, depending on how good the logistics is going. And then the truck backs up into that pickup facility and then takes the. But then, of course, this also prolongs the time where there's a high stocking density and there's not feed or water often. And depending on this pickup facility, is it placed in shade or sunlight and all that, then we can really challenge these sows even before they're actually put on the vehicle. But of course, this is the dilemma of increase or keeping biosecurity and then the welfare of these animals.
Absolutely, absolutely. One thing kind of keeps popping into my mind as we're visiting Cecilia, and that really goes back to would it be advantageous to feed that sow to hold her on the sow farm for a week or two, let her dry up, right? All the milk disappear, and feed her full feed just to kind of get her. I know we won't get body condition back in a couple of weeks, but at least kind of get the energy back in the correct order, right? We're no longer negative in energy, but more on the positive side. Do you think that there's any advantage to that as far as helping that sow manage the stress of transport?
Yes, so of course that would be some beneficial, but I just think it might be difficult from the economic perspective. So I don't know that in practice it would happen. But of course, legislation could say that that would be necessary. Um, you said dry off. Because we talk a lot about dry off when you talk about dairy cattle, and in a welfare setting, that dry off, we have to mitigate that and different ways of feeding that, or should we do it abruptly or not? But that's also not something that's talked about in sows. They are abruptly weaned, and well, with dairy cows, we know that um, this stench milk in the udder will be uncomfortable in some, maybe even potentially painful also, but at least uncomfortable. And the same might be the case for Cull sows. So even though we would keep her there and only transport her later on, she still experiences some discomfort just from the way that we are weaning. So that's also, and just then of course doing it at the same time as being transported then adds up. So I think that you do have a point that that might be something to do, but it won't solve all the challenges that the sows experiences.
Sure. Yeah, and the reason why I bring it up is that at least where I worked for a period of time, that was a requirement, was that the sow had to be dry. So we really couldn't ship her out for at least 5 to 7 days after she was weaned, because the harvesting groups did not want mammary glands full of milk. So just kind of that question, right, on will that really help us in this situation or no? The other negatives really outweigh even that opportunity to hold her for a week and kind of get her back in the correct balance.
And then, another interesting point, something that I didn't know, but when I was visiting one of the Danish slaughterhouses, we realized that a full udder with milk is actually something they can sell, and it's actually something that they get some money for. And it seems maybe there's actually there's a market for these others filled with milk. So that might, yeah, you just have to find the right market, I guess.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't have thought that you could find a market for that.
But that it exists, yeah.
Very interesting. Well, Cecilia, I see that our time is really almost up, and I've really enjoyed our conversation around sows and transport. And just to kind of recap to the audience, some of the conversation that we've had here is that there is some valid concern as to whether or not it is appropriate to transport cull sows off of the farm simply due to the fact that they have this depleted muscle mass and potentially have some pretty severe aggression they will undergo during transport. And again, of course, when we think about animal welfare, it's certainly something that we do want to think about and consider as we move forward. Before you leave us for today, we like to ask our guest speaker a couple of questions. The first question we like to ask you really focuses on swine. And it's, do you have a resource that you might recommend to the audience that they could go to for swine?
Yes. So it might be a bit of a heavy reading, but actually, what I'm reading right now is that there's a scientific opinion, or actually two scientific opinions that came out from EFSA, so the European Food and Food Safety Agency. So they made these huge scientific opinions about welfare of pigs on farm and during transport, where they really have, yeah, summarized all the literature and at different stages of the animals and what kind of animal welfare measures you can look at and what still needs to be done and all that. And it's a tremendous amount of work. And I think it's really, yeah, something, if you want to have some heavy reading, I suggest that's a good place to go to.
Perfect. We'll have to look that one up for sure. How about something that's not pig related? Do you have a book that you might recommend to the group?
Yes. So it's kind of still animal-ish related. But there's this book called The Psychobiotic Revolution by Cryan and Dinan. They work about with this gut-brain axis and the microbiota and all these different ways we maybe improve mood and behavior with animals and humans. And I found it really, really interesting. But I did read it because of some work-related stuff. But there was a whole new world of the microbiota that I think, well, we should, yeah, consider.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting, right? I've read a lot of that in the human side lately as to the changes in your microflora and how that may impact your mood over time. So I think it's actually really intriguing. Right? So many
Yes,
things we don't think about.
exactly.
Um,
And there might be stuff we can do also for the pigs, considering the way we feed them also. So I'm actually hoping to do some research in that the topic.
Very good. Very good. Well, the last question we like to ask our guest speaker is if you could think of someone in your life that you've defined as successful, what's a key trait about them that you think has allowed them to be successful?
Um, Keeping calm when fires erupt, and fires always erupt. Uh, and being able to see, okay, this is the different, like, we have these options and then we have to, yeah, put out the fire. If that makes sense. I'm thinking of my PhD supervisor and professor. She really, shit goes down, and yeah, doing animal experimentation, and yeah, and she always managed to, yeah, keep calm and find a way out.
And move
Maybe
on.
sometimes even better than what we actually aimed for, or at least that's what we convince ourselves of when the plan doesn't work.
I know. I always admire people who can do that, right? For me, my brain is gone and I'm panicked, and other people are like, no, let's just think about this and move forward.
Exactly,
So
and I'm probably also the panicky version, but that's why it's really great having her as a supervisor.
absolutely, absolutely, calm in the eye of the storm is always a great trait to have. Well, again, for our audience, this is Dr. Cecilia Keller, and she is from Denmark. And again, we want to thank you for your time, Cecilia.
Thank you.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.